I confess, I had to force myself to sit down this evening and start to write the podcast before every memory of today drifted off into a place never to be retrieved, exacerbated by badly scribbled notes, equally irretrievable. There were many elements to today's public inquiry, with some surprising twists and turns along the way. First up, a heartfelt thank you to the Earth Mamas, whose voices led us into the public inquiry. There was something incredibly powerful about seeing so many people show up, sing out, and remind everyone why this fight matters. The passion, solidarity, and soul that came through from you, the singers, was something quite special. Thanks to all of you for coming along, for your support, for your song, for your listening, and for giving your time and energy to protecting the Sperns. Every voice matters, every act of support matters, and together we're helping to keep this issue visible and impossible to ignore.
Hug my hain and sourlin, sour buina noin glegal. Hug my hain and sourlin, souru souru.
Now what else? I must not have been paying attention today, or perhaps I was simply tired. Instead of the usual 20 pages of notes, I've only got 5 this evening, not on top of my game or something. Topics today included peatlands and subsurface archaeology. First up, we were presented with a long and detailed and comprehensive CV of Dr. Jill Plunkett's accreditations and impressive academic achievements. I don't recall this level of detail happening with any of the other experts who had previously appeared on behalf of the applicant. Were they trying to ensure that nobody else in the room suffered from an inflated sense of their own intelligence? Or maybe attempting to establish that Dr. Plunkett is, in fact, the cleverest person any of us are ever likely to encounter? That said, she set about in a businesslike fashion rebutting the Historic Environmental Department HED previous arguments as to the presence or not of organic and stone archaeological remains in peatland, and by a dint of discussion arrived at the conclusion that the only thing we need to consider is the sub-peat archaeology. Things that came to light during the course of the conversation were that only a small area of the site had been assessed by Plunkett. She maintained that slopes are too steep for archaeological remains. This was quite amusing given the number of archaeological remains that are on the sides of mountains in Ireland. And going on to say that there was less than 1% chance of archaeological sites in the area. Later on in the morning, Dr. Gormley from HED basically demolished Plunkett's arguments, saying that the area had not been subject to a detailed archaeological investigation, saying it was a desktop review, whereas Dr. Plunkett visited the area, she did not walk the site. That developments will change the hydrological environment and that organic remains will not survive hydrological fluctuations. She spoke about additional possible fracturing of the surrounding peat due to the volume of peat to be removed. She criticised the proposed mitigation for the peat, i.e. keeping it wet in order to reuse it, and that the archaeological records are expected to be skewed because of this peat removal. What puzzled us, the third parties, was not Dr. Plunkett's expertise, which was beyond question, but how a scholar so closely associated with the conservation of peatland archaeology arrives at conclusions that appear to sit comfortably alongside a major mining proposal. Whether that reflects a different reading of the evidence, or a narrower professional remit, or a different philosophy of conservation is perhaps one of the more interesting questions raised by today's proceedings. The next question that came up referenced the impact of the industrial incursion on the St Mary's Church based in Ruski. HED remarked it was too far away to have any impact. And then Mary Brawley raised the annoying little fact that the church had no foundations and wanted to know if there was a neighbourhood notification or indeed was the priest notified of the aforementioned industrial blight. Beattie, counsel for DFI, didn't seem to be sure about this and said he would get back to the Commissioner. There was a fair amount of time spent discussing conditions attached to archaeology and power lines. Yet whenever third parties sought stronger safeguards, the response from the applicants was generally some variation of not that condition. It's a curious process. Everyone spends hours debating conditions that would only come into play if the mine is approved. Yet many of the people seeking those safeguards will have no influence over whether they are actually implemented in the years ahead. And that's the thing about conditions. They aren't a barrier to approval. They assume approval. And once you're discussing the conditions under which damage might occur, you've already moved a long way from the question of whether the mine should occur at all. After all, conditions don't stop a mine. They simply set the terms under which one proceeds. And lastly, for a few matters that remain stubbornly unresolved, at least in my mind, third parties have been under constant pressure to move things along, and significant timetable changes were introduced on the basis that time was running short. Those changes have real consequences, particularly for our expert witnesses who have arranged their lives around dates that now appear to be shifting beneath their feet. Yet despite repeated requests for updates on the schedule, the answers remain a blunt no. No indication of where things stand, no clarity on what happens next, and no acknowledgement of the difficulties these changes create for those trying to participate. It's beginning to feel like a curious mix of hurry up and wait, urgency when it comes to limiting scrutiny, but far less urgency when it comes to keeping us participants informed. One development that has left third parties feeling rather bruised is the decision to quietly retire certain topics on the grounds that they have been adequately covered. This raises an interesting question. In a public inquiry, who gets to decide when a subject has been sufficiently examined? Is it the people whose lives, livelihoods and communities may be affected? Or is it simply a matter of keeping the timetable moving? As a pretend planning consultant, I might be tempted to submit the following entirely fictional statement of case. Matter: premature closure of inconvenient questions. Case for the objectors: certain issues remain unresolved. Case for the timetable: yes, but have you considered the clock? Recommendation: the clock wins. Joking aside, all of these issues are complicated, contested and important. That's exactly why we're here in the first place. The fact that they're difficult or time-consuming to examine doesn't make them any less worthy of examination. There seems to be a curious logic at work here. A public inquiry appears to be in danger of becoming impatient with the public. And lastly, this evening, one final observation I'd like to make, and I offer it in the spirit of constructive reflection rather than criticism. Public inquiry is not just about what is said, it's also about what's been communicated through tone, body language, small signals that tell people whether they are being heard. Now, I fully accept that some third parties can test the patience of even the most saintly amongst us. We are, after all, a passionate bunch. But there are moments when the sighs, the visible frustration, the facial expressions, and the general air of exasperation becomes part of the proceedings too. The difficulty is that these things are rarely directed at one individual. When they happen, everyone on the third-party benches feels them. The message received, whether intended or not, is that public participation is something to be endured rather than welcomed. I suspect none of this is conscious. Most bias isn't. But it is worth remembering that respect is communicated in many ways, and impartiality is not only something that has to be practiced, it also has to be seen to be practiced. For those of us who have given up our time to engage in this process, that distinction really matters. I think I better leave it here for now. As usual, thanks for listening, and see you all soon.
Hag my heinen saurelin, sauru sauru.